welcome to Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
I'm your 5 out of 10 star host, Madelyn.
I'm your other host, Emma. I had nothing.
And thanks for tuning into the show. It's Side Quest Week. I hadn't thought about this as being like almost Valentine's Day themed, Emma, but it's a good almost Valentine's Day episode too.
You actually said it last week. You said Valentine's Day games as like your little joke,
Yeah.
right? Of like seasonal side quests. So that is part of what I was like, oh, this would be a good one.
I can't believe that I actually inspired you.
Yeah, it's pretty rare.
Well, Emma, it's a side quest. It's your choice. What's the topic?
Today we're doing, like a brief overview, basically, as we always do with these big topics of relationship systems in video games. So all those little romance systems, friendship systems, bond systems, whatever you want to call them. Building friendships and relationships within the boundaries of video game mathematics.
Nice. I love thinking about mathematics in my friendships.
Well, I mean, that's basically what it boils down to, right? Like, no matter how complex you make your relationship system, it is something that has to be calculated by math. There's no you can't pull in the full gamut of the relationship complexities. You can just do your best with however complicated the equation you want to put in there.
It makes you wonder if all of our relationships are really just math.
Very complicated math.
Or not.
You're right. Or not. I say hello to the post office man, and that is our mathematical equation relationship.
You tell him, I'm sorry my dog is barking.
That is my relationship with most delivery people I pass by. I'm like, I'm sorry. She hates you for a rational reason.
So, Emma, other than obviously my genius suggestion of Valentine's Day games, anything else serve as inspiration this week?
Yeah, so I guess it didn't just come out, but a couple of weeks ago, Fire Emblem Engage came out, the latest mainline title in the Fire Emblem series. I have been playing it a lot. I'm sitting here right now thinking about Fire Emblem. It is constantly in the back of my brain. So, because that's just how it is when there's a new Fire Emblem out.
Isn't that how it is just most of the time, regardless of whether Fire Emblem is new or
You're right.
not?
You're right. It is. It's just sort of sitting there in the back of my brain. But it's less dormant than it usually is, It's more active. More of an active back part of my brain.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm not finished with it yet, but I did read somewhere that Engage does not have paired endings for characters outside of your, player insert unit. So most of the time, well, since 6, I guess, which is the one before they started bringing them over to the West, Fire Emblem has had a support system where all of your different, characters in your army can have certain people that they can have conversations with, and if you strengthen their relationship enough, they'll have, a paired ending of some sort that sort of describes, sometimes it's romantic, sometimes it's not romantic, sometimes it's platonic or familial. But they'll have a little ending text at the end of the game that it's here's what their life together was like, right? And Engage doesn't have that, which makes me really sad. It still has supports. It has full-fledged supports. I was trying to figure out if it has more or less than 3 houses, and I'm not actually sure, in terms of shared numbers of conversations. But there's no I can't make characters fall in love or pledge lifelong bonds to each other anymore. It can only be my unit. Which, to be perfectly honest, I'm not terribly interested in like using my player insert unit to do romance. I like relationship building in games, which we'll talk about. I like building friendships and like learning more about characters. But the like pick one to date one is like something I'm just really not interested in. And so Fire Emblem has always been appealing to me because I can make other characters fall in love, right? Like I've got my action figures and I can make my action figures kiss, right? Versus most games where it's like you've got an action figure and the game's like, now kiss the action figure, right?
Yeah.
That's sort of how I think about it.
Do the, like, A supports not give you, like, lifelong bonds?
No. So this, I think the choice not to have endings is, like, it's opened up more, like, they could just have sort of more frivolous or funny sort of supports. But I think the way Three Houses handled that, of just having some that ended at B, was better. Because then you have you can write some, like, silly ones that don't have to be, like, worried about, like, the lifelong impact of these characters on each other. But without getting rid of, like, the paired endings ones, right? You can just have a certain number that I will have endings together. And I preferred that sort of system to the supports versus just having a bunch that aren't as, like, meaningful, I guess.
Well, that is a bummer. Then, I mean, I don't know. I think Three Houses has too many supports. So the fact that Engage has the same amount, I'm like, oh no.
Well, so it has the same amount, but there's absolutely less. You could not get all of them on a single playthrough unless you're insane.
Okay.
And, like, did, like, so many skirmishes all of the time.
Sure.
There's a lot less opportunity to, like, build support points, so you really do have to pick the characters that you want to see the supports with still.
Okay,
versus in Three Houses, there's, like, tons of opportunities to build support points among your team in a way that isn't in this one. I, like, actively trying. I've had, like, 2 units. It took, like, 4 battles of having them, like, stand next to each other the whole time to get to, like, the next support level. Like, actively trying. So it's like, very difficult to build support in this one, for some reason.
Okay, I welcome that. Because as I think I talked about a little in our, like, NPC info dump episode, just, like, having to watch, like, 10 supports every time you get back from a battle week in Three Houses was eventually too much, and was particularly eventually too much when it felt like, oh man, like, you've revealed this secret about yourself to, like, 3 people and 3 separate supports, and I understand why that has to happen, but I'm tired of it.
Yeah. I mean, the more classic structure of Engage is also, like, you know, there's some units that you're not using, right?
Yeah.
In a way that's different from Three Houses, in which case you could pretty much always be like, actually, I want to use this unit and fix it, you know?
Yeah.
But anyway, that's enough about Fire Emblem discourse. Fire Emblem is actually not, like I said, it's not actually a great jumping off point, because I do think it handles relationships, like, because you can pair up other characters, right? Yeah. Like, it's only in, like, Awakening that there's been, like, an actual player insert character that, like, has, like, a significant presence in the story anyway. And supports have been in the game for, like, 5 games before that, 6 or 5 games before that. And so it's always about, like, you have all of these different characters and you can have them have relationships with each other. But most relationship systems are based around you're playing as this character, and this character can build relationships with a bunch of other characters. But the other characters can't build relationships among each other, right?
Yeah. Well, can I talk about one more Fire Emblem thing before we...
Sure, I love Fire Emblem. It's happening in the back of my brain right now.
I did want to talk about the shift from... And I had read an article about this in it, and it brought back, like, the dormant memory of, oh yeah, I do remember this being a thing in... I don't know what the Japanese subtitle was, but Fire Emblem and Fire Emblem Sacred Stones.
The Blazing Blade is the 7.
Sure. But I do remember in those games it being like you had 5 total supports. Like
yes.
5 support ranks. and that was it, as opposed to Three Houses, where it's like, you have to talk to everyone is your friend, you're kind of in love with everyone, like support bonanza. And I wanted your thoughts on what you think is true to life. What you think makes a better game. Both is good.
It's interesting because it is like, is your emphasis on like sort of gameplayness or on writingness, right? Because I remember, because it is limited, you cannot get to A support with more than one character.
Yeah.
Right? That means that things can be written smoother. Like a romance progression, for instance.
Yeah.
You can actually have like a build up to it, and then the A rank is like a confession of that romance directly, right? Versus if you can, and Awakening and Fates sort of dealt with this by, there would be a separate S support rank after you got to A, that would be like confessing love to each other. Fates had its own problems of, can you avoid the incest game show challenge? But putting that aside, they would have like a separate conversation for that. Whereas, like in Three Houses, there isn't like a separate conversation where they're like, and we will be married in the future, right? Yeah. It just sort of picks the one that has the most support points by the end, and that's the one with the paired ending. So none of the A supports, they can be suggestive, but none of them can be like definitive, right? Because otherwise that causes issues if they end up with someone else and you're like, what happened?
On the flip side of things, it causes issues if you somehow play like Clickbait Boyfriend, where only like 2 people pair off in the end.
Yeah.
He was like, wait, my action figures.
But yeah, but from a gameplay sense, if you're using support, and this has always done this, it is given the characters boosts when they fight near each other, and the higher the support is, the bigger the boosts. So being able to support with all units means that you're more free to have a different team composition, right? Because you don't have to worry about like, I'm doing a support with Erica and Innes, but I don't want to use Innes, right? Or like, I'm not, this character I'm bringing in doesn't have support with anyone, so they're not getting any bonuses, and so I'm wasting stuff, right? So there's that too.
And of course, it's true that you can really only have one real friend in the world.
Well, what I liked about the way the old ones were written is like, that would be like big life-changing relationship thing at the end of like A, usually. Like your romance, or you can find your father, or your long-lost brother is this pirate guy, or you're talking to your girlfriend's murderer or whatever.
Haven't
right?
we all been there where that pirate guy is really your long lost brother? This is not a universal human relationship moment.
That's what I'm saying. So like, that was always like really significant relationships, right? Versus a lot of like more frivolous ones that you can have now.
Well, Emma, sorry to sidetrack you putting Fire Emblem away. I'll put it away now. You're right. I couldn't think of, and I didn't encounter too many other options where you could also play around with pairing off other characters.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't find, I didn't like really scour. So there might be ones out there, but it is not a popular thing. It is certainly not prevalent to the degree that like main character romances are now.
Well, it certainly doesn't appear on all of the listicles of like best romance systems, greatest relationship side quests, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Which is interesting because I just feel like it's such a very popular part of Fire Emblem, and something that doesn't feel, well, all of game development is hard. Right? But it's something that doesn't feel like that complicated to implement relative to the threshold that all of game development is hard. So it's interesting that it really is, like, in the mainstream, very much a Fire Emblem thing.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I think that Fire Emblem is a little bit unique among a lot of tactics games for having, like, I guess, like, very singular characterful units that you use, right? So that's why it maybe stands out among other tactics games. And then if you look at something like Persona, for instance, part of that, at least among modern Persona, is the self-inserting, right? Of, like, living your ideal high school life. And so what if the character wants to date this character, you know? They have to all be available and in love with you so that you can live out your idealized fantasy high school life. So it's about the priorities of the game, too.
Well, and that does get into something that's a real hallmark of the modern relationship system, which is the evolution from, and much of this is good, right? It's good that games have evolved from, like, you know, you can only romance the one romanceable woman with your male character and the one romanceable man with your female character. Like, this is not to say that all of this progression is bad. Much of it is good. But it has moved from, there's a couple of romance options, you know, with a very simplistic system around it, to you can romance anyone. Like, everyone is bisexual, which is fine. Like, there's nothing wrong with being bisexual, but it's like, nothing is off limits to you. Anyone will fall in love with you if you just give them enough of the jerky that they love, or whatever.
I don't know. I read a lot of that, of, like, that's prevalent now. I don't know what games they're talking about.
I mean, I think that they're talking about Mass Effect.
Yeah, I guess Mass Effect.
I think whenever people are talking about this, they're talking about BioWare more generally.
Yeah. BioWare is definitely, if you're looking at the Western side of game developments, are definitely the, like, company that has popularized, certainly, the, like, romance subplots in RPGs.
Definitely. And, you know, in ways that now get a lot of, like, oh, it's so, like it's all math kind of criticism. But it's like, I mean, this is cool. I mean, the Mass Effect series has lots of flaws to it, but it's ambitious and it's neat, and good for them for popularizing this, because we like these systems. So give me more dolls.
But let me force them to date each other. I don't want to get too far into this. I am resistant towards, like, I'll do it if it's there. I think in Persona 5, like, I dated Makoto because it felt like the game wanted me to. And I didn't really care. And that's sort of how I approach all, like, romances where my character has to, like, pick someone to romance. Is like, what does it feel like the game wants me to do? Unless it's Cold Steel 4, in which case Reen is the eternal bachelor. He will never date anybody.
He is a bad man. No, I mean, I had several girlfriends in Persona 5 simply because, like, I don't know, I could.
And then they get mad at you, though.
Yeah, like, whatever. Like, that's fun, too. There was no actual consequences to it, so whatever.
The way, Persona 4 introduced, like, wow, you can just be platonic with your girlfriends. But
who knew?
Persona 3, there were, like, interviews of, like, Shino being like, how do girls and boys be friends? Which is so cringy. But there is no, you cannot, if you max out a social link, you're dating the girl. So, like, there was this whole system of, like, broken and reverse social links that's sort of just, like, based on jealousy, because the boy main character is dating, like, 7 girls at once and has to balance that. So you can't go too long without spending time with a girl. You can't get caught on dates with other girls. It's a lot.
That's probably more realistic than most of them, though. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
if you have 7 girlfriends, it should be hard work.
Somewhat contrary to, like, the game's themes, I feel like, but it's sure realistic.
Shh, don't worry about the game's themes. All I'm saying is, if you had 7 girlfriends, you would have to work really hard. That's all.
Yeah. It's really funny to compare and contrast, just because I've been playing P3P through 2. The girls' social links, when there's only, like, 4 dateable characters, and one of them is Ken, which is a whole can of worms that I won't get into. But they're also treated more like actual dating sim routes, in that you have to hit certain flags along their social link by saying the right thing, or else they will reject you.
Interesting. But see, this starts to get I feel like this whole episode is going to be like, well, this isn't how real relationships work. So here we go, part 1. I understand why as a developer you wouldn't like that, because I know as a player I would be pissed, right? As a player I would be upset if I did everything right and I wanted to date Joe Schmo, but I happened to say the wrong thing because I misinterpreted the tone that the character would be like, "You're a dummy," with, or something like that. And then I don't get to date him, and I've spent like 100 hours. I realize that maybe they aren't all quite as long as Persona 5, but I've spent like 50 hours trying to date Joe Schmo. And like now I've ruined it.
Yeah.
And of course real relationships don't necessarily work like that. Like, it's not like if I
I mean, it is attempting to ape, like you have, whether you've like made your interest clear or not, whether you've felt like you've gotten the chemistry going, and like the other person's not feeling it if you're not compatible with them,
right.
So it's trying to ape that just through like every dialogue you have like 3 options to pick from system.
Which is how it works in real conversation. In any conversation, there's only 3 things you could possibly say.
It's true.
But what I'm saying is that's like more realistic than most of these things. Like, even though it would be frustrating from a player perspective to miss a flag and then get locked out of something, it's more realistic than most of these, where it's just like, well, I can hang out with people on whatever time frame I want to. It doesn't matter if I blow them off texting me for like weeks at a time. Like, our relationship always advances. So like that is like that sort of like progression element, that like always moving forward, that always stepping up thing, obviously is not necessarily how real relationships work, but it is so core to how these game mechanics almost always work that it's really notable when there is anything that is not that.
Yeah. And I mean, I think the main issue is like a way that a lot of these work is like you hit an end point, right?
Yeah.
And then if you're, in like a RPG or a tactics game or whatever, where like relationship building is incentivized through some sort of gameplay tie-in, there's no longer any gameplay benefit to hanging out with your best friend who will now die for you, right? So you just ignore them for like 6 months, which is what I did with Ryuji Persona 5.
Poor Ryuji Persona 5.
No, Ryuji, I won't see a movie with you. We are already ranked 10. There's never any need to hang out ever again.
Well, I think even beyond that, I mean, you mentioned the tactical benefit of it, and of course, in Persona 5, their personas level up at the end, right? And you get all sorts of like new ability things as you go up the ranks. But I think in a game like Persona, even without that, even if leveling up Ryuji was purely I get to know Ryuji better and there's no tactical benefit to it, I still don't think I would hang out with him past level 10. Because it's not even like, I don't do those, well, whatever. It's been so long since I've played Persona, right? So I can't recreate my exact thought process. But generally when I'm doing Fire Emblem supports, or I'm doing Persona links, or This is a little bit less the case with the drink links in Yakuza Like a Dragon, because I do really want to be able to switch some people out of my party without them falling way behind in experience. So there's a little more on my mind than it usually is. But I'm not usually doing it because I'm like, yeah, Ryuji's finally going to be able to... I can't even remember what the things are along the way on that path anymore.
Die for you, really, is the important one.
Well, I'm much more invested in the storytelling of it than I am in the nominal RPG benefit, generally.
Sure, but I'm prioritizing usually, like, the characters that I use in my party, right?
Sure. But I'm saying, okay, like, yes, but even if that wasn't the case, once I hit Ryuji's endpoint, even if there was no benefit, I still wouldn't go to the movies with him, because I want more story. I want more people to talk to me and tell me that they will die for me, that kind of thing.
Yes, yeah.
Which is probably a bad way to lead your actual friendship life. You can't get to the die for each other stage and then be like, I'm gonna have somebody else now that I'm gonna teach to want to die for me.
Yeah.
So bad friendship advice.
It is also the unfortunate result of the way Persona 5 handles this a little better, I feel like, than like Persona 4, but like it feels like they're all friends with like you.
Yeah.
And that's it. They're not friends with each other.
Sometimes in New York that's how it is, Emma. So it's just how life, that's perfectly realistic.
When will An die for Yusuke? Is what I
She would not.
I
That support would not go that far. Nice try. I do think it's interesting. I don't know, this comes up on our side quests sometimes a lot. This like, well, there's this really ubiquitous game mechanic or kind of like side quest mechanic here, but it's almost always implemented in a way that is really, really similar and sometimes more complicated than others, right? But it's almost always with these relationship things, you know, there's levels to it, and whether those are numeric levels or like a number of hearts or whatever it is, like categories of like descriptors of how good friends you are. There's that, and you level up those things by spending time with the character or by giving them gifts or by like using them in battle, maybe.
Yeah.
And it always moves upward, and there's an eventual end point with a culmination of some sort. And then there's never an incentive to hang out with them ever again.
Yeah.
And it's so ubiquitous that it's hard to think of a friendship system that would be different, or a relationship system that would be different than that.
Yeah.
Sorry, Josh.
I mean, it's very like simplified, right? And sometimes sort of because a lot of it is also like, are you saying the correct thing to them, right? Which can be funny. Of like, I remember like this particular thing that couldn't not be like the writers being like, this is silly, but like, you know, in Fire Emblem Three Houses, you run around the monastery and like talk to characters, and sometimes you have a choice, and one of them will give you support points, and one of them won't in like the dialogue option. So there's one where like Caspar and Linhardt are fighting because Caspar chews with his mouth full, right? And like they're like next to each other essentially in the cafeteria, and you'll say to Caspar, "No, eating fast is important. You know, you got to get on with your day." And then you'll go over and immediately say to Linhardt, "Yeah, it's gross. It's disgusting. Shouldn't be acceptable."
Look, okay, on one hand, that kind of two timing sometimes is realistic in certain relationships, right? Like, let's not.
It does really get to the heart of like how this is gamified, because you're not really thinking about like your honest opinion, right? You're thinking like, I have to build support points with these characters, so I should say what they want to hear, right?
Well, and that, you know, I think we both read this sort of interesting piece about a much more complicated relationship system in the indie game, what is it, Scarlet Hollow?
Yeah.
Which has like relationships tracked along like 5 axes, which like good for them, man. This is what I mean when it's like it's hard to even imagine a system that operates differently, because I read this and I was like, yikes. Like
it seems to be based on how each character perceives your character, right? So based on dialogue options you have around them, whether they're perceiving you in a certain way. So like, will your compliments come off as sincere or as sarcastic based on what that character thinks about your character? Which, like, yeah, that makes total sense, right? Some people are nice and you just get a bad impression of them and you're like, they must be fake, you know?
Yeah.
Like, that's very real. But also, like, yeah, that sounds so complicated to handle in terms of, like, just, like, especially when it has to do with, like, really story-based things, it scales up the complexity of, like, what you need to write, right? And what you need to account for. So, like, there might be various different responses based on what you're saying and how the character is perceiving you. And you have to account for all of that and make sure that they all make sense to the player as they're playing the game and doesn't feel, like, unnatural or like it's coming out of nowhere. Which, just wild. It reminds me a little, like, I Was a Teenage Exocolonist has relationship building as well. And they do actually, what I like about that game is that there are certain relationships that, like, if you don't impact something early on, right? Like, 2 of your friends will be in a relationship, and obviously then you can't date them later. Right? So, like, there will be relationships that blossom if your character isn't, like, changing things based on that. It makes the characters feel more real because they have relationships with each other, right? Which I like as well.
But see, I think what's often, it comes down to something that, again, I feel like we've talked about on the podcast sort of frequently over the past 6 months in the context of role-playing in games and in just, like, the huge widening of player choice in games, I think. In that, you know, with few exceptions, when these relationship builders, like you said, you're just incentivized to try to pick the answer that you think the character wants to hear. And it doesn't incentivize you to create any kind of consistent characterization of even a self-insert character, which is sort of funky, right? Because, like, if it's a self-insert character, presumably the ideal would be, well, you want to play it like yourself, or at least like the idealized version of yourself that you wish you were. But frequently in these things you are not, right? Like, probably the idealized version of yourself doesn't, like, lie to Linhart and Gaspar right in front of each other about what you think about, like, him chewing with his mouth open. So it incentivizes you to play in this sort of, like, like, sycophantic, two-faced kind of way where you're always just telling the person that you're talking to at that moment what they want to hear. And also that so much of the time, whatever, I won't talk about that. What this is making me think of is not relationship systems. It's making me think of the no consequences for unforgivable curses stuff that has been around on the internet.
You don't want to judge the player, you know, for torturing people.
But that's the thing too, is on a whatever, a more relationship-y level than that. There's, like, so few of these systems, do you end up in a situation where it's like, actually, like, because you didn't answer An's texts, like, 5 weeks in a row or 5 days in a row, like, she actually doesn't want to be your friend anymore.
Yeah.
Or because you made this particular decision, like, you actually can't romance that person anymore because they don't think that you would be a long-term partner or something like that. So the actual, it all falls into this, like, not all, I'm sorry, I'm talking in, like, big generalizations here, but so much of this standard relationship building stuff just falls into this weird little like wish fulfillment bucket of like, if you just always say the exact right thing to someone, regardless of who you are outside of that, like you get to have sex with them at the end.
Yeah. I think, I mean, one thing that happens a lot, I think, is because the relationships are so segregated from each other, right? Like, if I, if I, like, say to Caspar, like, yeah, eat with your mouth open, and then immediately go to Linhart and say, no, that's gross, like, in real life, Caspar would turn to me and be like, hey, I'm right here. And that's, like, one way to sort of address some of these things is like have scenes with multiple characters, and then like, you know, based on the choices you make, you're getting some sort of benefit or like penalty from either side, right? And that sort of it disincentivizes just like lying whatever feels like the character would like it in the moment, right? It requires you to actually like make a choice, make a character choice, right? Because there's benefits and penalties to whatever you choose, right? But because a lot of these things are so like separate from each other, like you have the conversation with this one character, right? And this is the case, you know, in JRPGs, and I think in BioWare stuff and Western RPGs that handle it this way too, of like you build your relationship with this one character, and that doesn't intersect with your relationships with another one, right? Like, what if you, like, went on, like, a social link and said something, like, bad about your friend behind their back, and then it turns out, like, they find out you said that, right? Yeah. Like, of course they would. But it doesn't, the mechanics of it aren't interested in those sorts of intergroup complexities of like gossip and talking about each other with each other. They're just like, here's this character arc. It doesn't really intersect with anybody else's.
And it's so difficult, right? Because on the one hand, when you have a whole game full of interesting characters, you want to be able to get to know them all.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, because game development is hard, you have to keep the options pretty limited if you wanted to implement anything even close to what Emma and I are like wanting here, which is like much more interaction between the paths and more options for change based on like what you said to two people together, or that somebody else told somebody, or paths that are locked off until you get close to their friends, right? Like Spice Girls style. So that took a minute, but like it's just it's interesting to me how, I mean, it's all really gamified and really transactionally gamified, and like, will that change? Or is the fact that these systems are still like not in every game, still kind of like exciting when they're in a game, you know, are we years and years and years away from like even slightly more realistic or interesting, I won't necessarily realistic, slightly more complex character dynamic systems?
I mean, I think that it'll be interesting to see, because like once you start getting into like, oh, I want to write complex character dynamics, you start thinking like, well, why don't I just script it, right?
Yeah.
Because, you know, you get like romances and friendships in all games, right? Just whether the player has choice on those romances and friendships versus the writer being like, you know, these characters are in love, you know, or these characters are really great friends, you know. And those relationships will develop through just the way that the story plays out. And like, I see that's way less complicated than trying to deal with like, oh, the player is at this level relationship with this person and this level relationship with this person, and I have to account for like what they said in this conversation, right?
Yeah.
So trying to marry like complex character relationships and player choice is a lot more difficult than either having player choice in relatively simple relationships or just putting complexity in the writing itself, right?
Well, it does ultimately feel like it's more or less impossible if you're making a game that isn't sort of purely about the relationships.
Yeah.
Like I under this, none of this is meant. There's plenty of things to criticize about the like BioWare relationship systems, but none of this is really meant as like a, well, you should have in Mass Effect 1 had like better branching relationships with each other when like they were still dealing with everyone being like lesbian alien sex. So, like it's obvious why this like is really, really hard to implement once your game either has anything else going on but the relationships or is longer than like 3 hours long.
Yeah.
So just man yells at cloud, I guess. But yeah. It's also I am also sort of interested in, now that you can just look up, of course strategy guides and stuff always existed, but like Fire Emblem, I think of Fire Emblem and Three Houses and like the gift giving, right? And it's like, it's not even, you don't even have to pay attention to anything and like learn anything about the character. You just say, I want to max this out, so I'm going to Google what gifts I have to give. So even if you try to create a system that's like, well, you have to learn something about a character to know what to give them to increase your points, you have to account for the fact that players are not going to do that. They're just going to go to whatever their game guide is online.
I mean, that's sort of a unavoidable challenge because, like, gift giving makes sense from a certain point of view. It doesn't really make sense that I can like spam rocks at a character and they will like me more, but whatever. But there's no way to randomize that sort of thing, right? Because it's a character trait, right? Yeah. So you couldn't even be like, oh, like randomly the character will like different gifts so that players can't look it up because that weakens the character in a different way, right?
Yeah.
So unfortunately, I don't think there's any like getting around that. You just have to accept that. I mean, all games sort of have to accept like that some players are just gonna look up guides and that's fine, you know. It doesn't like, it makes every part of a game a little bit more like laid bare, I guess.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. Like, it's just whether the player is like, well, it's a game, and I don't care if I can see the game systems by looking up a guide. And it sort of does that for all aspects of a game, not just relationship building. And that's not like I look up guides.
No,
sometimes.
Course.
So that's not like a criticism when people do that. I think it's fine, but it's interesting.
Well, and we haven't even, and we won't on this episode, but I'll bring this up. In researching this, I did find some interesting articles, like both about how do games incentivize in games like Overcooked or in games like It Takes Two, right? How do games incentivize like actual relationship building between like real live human people who are sitting on the same couch or who are on the same voice chat, at least. And also a lot of research into how multiplayer online games can create relationship and encourage relationships between strangers who meet, which is not really something, it seems very obvious when you say it. Like, yeah, of course you want people's warriors of light to like befriend other ones in Final Fantasy XIV. Or whatever. And of course, everyone has had the experience, I think, of playing Apex or playing Fortnite or playing insert your preferred shooter here, and it being like, wow, like that person just saved my life. Kind of like that weird little moment of connection. So it seems sort of obvious, but it's not something I had really thought about in detail of, like you have to create opportunities for that to happen, and you have to like figure out how to design your game so like you develop those relationships. So very different than relationship systems, but it was an interesting tangent in the like, oh man, if you think it's complicated to design a 10-step system to like befriend your pixel buddy. Imagine how difficult it is to design a system that's gonna like make actual strangers into friends who want to raid together every week.
Yeah.
Other than Fire Emblem, do you have a favorite? Do you have a favorite relationship system in games?
I mean, not really. What it really is, like, what I like about Fire Emblem is that, like, I'm not involved, you know?
Yeah.
I'm the little puppet master above, being like, oh, now keys. And there just aren't a lot of things that are like that, you know? Like, in Animal Crossing, you put that on here, like, you can bond with your neighbors, but what I really wanted was for my neighbors to freaking talk to each other, which never happened.
It's so delightful when you catch them having a conversation. It's, like, the best thing. And I feel like the game knows that, so it doesn't give it to you. Apparently it never gave it to you. It doesn't give it to you that often. But when you catch
I got,
them...
like, one in the months I played that game. And that probably contributed to me not wanting to play it as much. If they had caught them, like, the neighbors, like, bonding more, I would have been more invested in making sure that village was, you know, well-stocked and looking nice, because everybody was friends with each other.
That is,
but as far as I know, my neighbors didn't even know each other.
That is always something I want more of from Animal Crossing, to be honest. And they're just not going to do it. It's not that kind of game. They won't do it. But I do always want more interaction between the neighbors.
Yeah.
With the caveat that it's been a very long time since I've played Stardew Valley seriously, although I'm tempted to pick it up again. Tempted. Like, those characters in that town, like, do sort of have, like, scripted relationships with each other a little bit. But it's interesting to me that, like, and again, like, I played this game a lot, like, 4 years ago, something like that, 4.5, 5 years ago. So it's very possible this has changed. There have been a lot of updates since then. But that feels like a game where it would really naturally be like, oh, like, more of these people would be interacting and, like, building their own relationships over time.
Yeah.
And even there, it doesn't really seem to happen. So it's totally unreasonable for me to expect it from Animal Crossing, where they've had, like, 20 years to put in a system like that, and they refuse.
Yeah. I did, like, I didn't finish a lot of the character, or really any of the character plots in Hades, but I like that a lot of them did, like, overlap with each other, right? Like, you'd have to build a relationship with one character to advance, like, that plot line. You know, like Orpheus and Eurydice, or like Nyx and Chaos, right? So, like, continue to see those character stories. Like, it would involve, like, multiple ones into a plot.
Well, I also think that something Hades does well is, in addition to the very formulaic give X gifts, get X scene kind of mechanics, the fact that you then also get, like, all of these, like, totally zero stakes interactions with people after most of your runs, I think is valuable in that feeling a little bit richer.
Yeah.
And that not every time that I talk to, pick whatever character down there that you know, use your favorite, not every time I talk to that character do I, like, get a little heart thing that goes up, right? It's just, like, sometimes we just talk.
Yeah, and I actually liked, like, sometimes they're having a conversation with someone else and you cannot give them a gift that run.
Yeah.
There's, like, a little bit of friction to, like, the gift-giving stuff that was nice, right? Like, I couldn't just run up to a character every single time I went there and give them a gift and, like, progress it that way. Like, it would force me to wait sometimes between runs. Or sometimes they just wouldn't be there, you know?
Yeah.
They're off doing their own thing, which also is just nice. Like, having a little bit of, like, oh, man, my perfectly laid plans.
But I do think that gameplay-wise, that's hard to implement in an RPG. Like Hades, it's like, well, whatever, right? Like if Orpheus isn't there this time, like it's okay, like he'll be there next time. As opposed to in a Persona like or in any kind of RPG where things have to move forward in a certain amount of game time, it would definitely be a lot more frustrating for it to be like, well, this is the week that I had set aside to talk to Orpheus, and now he's busy.
Yeah.
And like, whatever, that is very realistic, right? Sometimes that is how it is. You're like, this is the week where I'm going to catch up with people that I know. And they're like, we're busy, Madelyn. And I'm like, but this is the only week. And that's how it goes, right?
Yeah, I think Persona 5 sort of did away with like characters had like set schedules. Like there were days that you could hang out with certain characters and you would pick and choose between certain ones on those days. And also like weather would maybe impact whether you could do things, right?
Yeah.
Like you don't join a sports team in Persona 5, which you do in 3 and 4, and like on inclement weather days or right before exams, they don't have clubs. You can't hang out with those characters. Again, like Persona 5, like smoothing and frictionless relationship building a little bit,
That ideal high school life.
It is. It's the ideal high school life.
I was thinking, I think the only other game that I've played with a relationship system where you can get two other characters to kiss that I can think of off the top of my head is those two people that work at the coffee shop in Judgment. That must have been your favorite.
Yeah, that was nice.
My critique, I did like the Judgment system, although my critique with that, as with all Yakuza games, is like, put like a 5-minute timer or something on the next event popping up. It's too easy to just be like this just happened to me in Like a Dragon. There was like a sub quest with a guy who his father owns a Chinese restaurant, and he's like seeing someone that his father doesn't approve of, but he's also supposed to be training in his Chinese cooking. And I was trying to go to this restaurant because we were dead, and I just wanted to eat some good freaking food. But I was like, okay, like I know I'm just gonna talk to him outside of it, and then I'm gonna go into the restaurant. So I talked to him. He's like, I'm gonna go train and become better at Chinese food. And I tried to go into the restaurant, and it immediately triggered the next scene. It's like,
so
I guess
funny.
you've been training. I just wanted some mapo tofu. Okay.
He was really naturally talented. He only needed like 30 seconds of training.
Yeah, got a job in 30 seconds, ran across time.
Yeah.
But generally, I did like the friendship system in Judgment. I thought that was fun. It was a fun. I do always like it gamified it in ways that I didn't always like feel like were quite what I wanted. But I have always liked in the Yakuza Like a Dragon games when you have a sub story and it's like, oh look, there's that guy.
Yeah.
The stuff where it's a little bit more emergent and a little bit less like I'm heart leveling up and just like I'm doing another quest with this guy and getting to know him better kind of stuff.
Neo The World Ends With You has like a sort of similar networking system for like the shop owners and restaurant workers where like if you go to eat there a lot they start, like recognizing you. They had this in the original too, but it's a little bit more gamified in Neo. So you can get like benefits from like visiting a restaurant a lot and they'll know you and be like, hello, here's our special menu item or whatever.
I love when restaurant owners do that.
Yeah. I've never been a regular anywhere, so I don't know what it's like.
I feel like I have like two places. Well, we had that coffee place we used to have, but my boyfriend hated that. We were like members of like a coffee club for a couple months, and he would get asked about his research, and he really didn't enjoy that. So it's not all it's cracked up to be. You're
not meant to be a regular. It seems like
you can't level up the friendship level with everyone. Well, Emma, any closing thoughts on relationship systems?
I think that I just really think more games should let me pair up my friends instead of making me date them. And I would enjoy games a lot more.
Yeah. More romance, less romance for the main character.
I know that's, like, not popular, right? I'm sure more people like the romance systems as they are than me. But, like, oh my god, Cold Steel 4 Cold Steel in general would be so much improved if there was, like, one other relationship. Like, just, like, 2 of my classmates fall in love with each other instead of all the girls being in love with Reen. Like, be so improved.
I think it can even be fine if they want to still make all the girls an option, and it's just, like, at some point, you can choose, like, no, like, actually, she's gonna be with this other person.
Yeah, I just want my students to date instead of my students being in love with me.
Like, you can still, you don't have to cut out any of the wish fulfillment. You can still make all of them, like, viable romance options. Just let the player choose. It's all about that player choice. Give the player the choice.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, this has been another episode of Talk This.
It's dangerous to podcast alone.
If you have thoughts on relationship systems, favorite Fire Emblem supports, games that you feel like broke from this formula of give gifts, get friendship, I don't know, if you're someone out there that's like, no, I should be able to romance even more people in the game world, and let me tell you why. Tell us why on social media. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at Talk This Podcast. You can also visit our website, www.talkthispodcast.com. Why did I suddenly doubt that it was .com?
It is .com. Yes.
Sorry. www.talkthispodcast.com, where you can read all about the show, check out the games in the hat, and read our blog featuring long-running series Clickbait Boyfriend, my 10 heart support rank, and Split Screen. Finally, though, and most importantly, if you want to build that relationship ranking with your friendly neighborhood podcast hosts, you should subscribe. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, Spotify, Pandora Podcasts, online and on the app, Overcast, Pocket Cast, anywhere you can find a podcast, whatever your podcast platform relationship of choice is. Go ahead and subscribe to Talk This. Next week, we are talking about games.
I know Facade is their old game. I'm looking at the new game list, and I do not know.
Let's take a look. In any case, in 1 week, we'll talk about an old game and a new game.
Like I said, the old game is Facade. I just don't know
Pentiment?
what the new game is. What?
I think it might have been Pentiment.
Oh, maybe it was Pentiment. Yes. Yes, that sounds right.
Because you were like Xbox.
Yes, right. Yes, Xbox brain.
So Xbox week next week. So will Madelyn play any of them? We'll find out. You were like, Facade you can play online. It's all coming back. But if you really want to hear this dialogue for the first time, you should listen to last week's episode. And then in 2 weeks, it'll be Save Data, what Emma and I have been playing for the past 6 weeks.
More
Will
Fire
I finish
Emblem
Like
talk.
a Dragon in time? I don't know. I'm scared. They keep telling me, you should grind now. And I'm scared.
Oh yeah, have they given you like the fighting arena? Because you should fight in it.
Yeah, I've already done some fighting in the fighting arena.
Okay.
But if you want to hear more of this kind of riveting commentary, tune in 2 weeks for Save Data. And also Emma going, I still want other people to date and not Reen.
Yeah.
Those are the headlines. But for now, that's it for this week's show. Thanks for tuning in. Emma, do you have a good sign-off?
You go ahead.
All right. This week, I hope that somebody gives you the 2 heart up gift of your choice.